Good evening and welcome. I'm Marie Wilson, the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Business and Law at the University of South Australia. I'd like to acknowledge that this forum is being held on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, pay my respect to the elders both past and present, and acknowledge the spiritual traditions and attachment to this land, as well as its stewardship, particularly in the interest of emerging leaders of the Kaurna people and other Aboriginal peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge the generosity of business school alumnus Andrew Pridham, the benefactor of Pridham Hall, which we're now seated in. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Women's Suffrage and Economic Empowerment event tonight, and it's a panel discussion. This event will celebrate our successes over the last 125 years. Women in South Australia not only won the right to vote, but the ability to stand for Parliament, although I'm told on good authority that was an amendment intended to defeat the bill. This was before their peers across Australia and the rest of the world. While we still have some way to go before our rights translate to equal representation, equal treatment, and a lot of other equal things, it is what this means for our ability to participate in decision-making and have a voice that has mattered. I would like to express my appreciation and thanks to the staff within the Women's Economic Network whose enthusiasm has driven this event. Dr. Bethany Cooper and Elizabeth Alvaro deserve special attention, and thank you to all the members who have supported this event. I'd like to welcome our guest speakers for the panel. Senator the Honourable Penny Wong, Annabel Crabb, Australian political journalist, commentator and television host, Clare Wright, Australian historian, author and broadcaster from La Trobe University, and our moderator this evening, Tory Shepherd, the state editor of The Advertiser, as well as the Economic Society of Australia National President, Danielle Wood from the Grattan Institute. It's a very distinguished group, and I'm sure that's why it's drawn such a distinguished audience and to be here this evening. I would particularly like to thank the sponsors of this event, the University of South Australia Business School, so I get to thank myself, the Department of Human Services of South Australia, the Economic Society of Australia, and the Women in Economics Network of South Australia. I'm now going to hand over to Danielle Wood, the current chair of the Women in Economics Network, who will speak briefly about the Women in Economics Network and introduce our guest speakers.
Thank you very much, Marie, and thank you to UniVSA and to all our other sponsors for their support. The Women in Economics Network is, of course, thrilled to be hosting such a fabulous panel to reflect on this historically incredibly important event. Thanks to Elizabeth and Bethany for organising today and for the invite to say a few words about the network. We formed just 3.5 years ago with the objective of promoting and supporting women working in the economic profession. Everyone knows a lot about gender balance issues in STEM. I can assure you in economics it's just as acute, and in my view I think it's just as important, particularly given the role that economists play in all sorts of public policy debates. So since the network was launched, we've held over 100 events. We've had great discussions on everything from the budget to the gender pay gap to the economic value of the Great Barrier Reef. We've established an annual mentoring retreat which focuses on junior and mid-career women, and we've also set up mentoring programs in most states, including here in South Australia. And we're working with schools, with teachers associations, with universities to boost the pipeline of future female economists. So I'm pleased to say that there are some green shoots. Women are now close to 50% of Economic Society members. It was only a quarter before the Women in Economics Network was launched. Women have won 67%, 2/3 of awards from the Economic Society in the past 3 years. Prior to that, it was 4% in the preceding 30 years. When we started the network, 9% of people cited as economists in the media were women. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to update that statistic, but we've been working actively with media organisations, and it's certainly no longer unheard of to open a newspaper or to turn on your TV and radio and to hear not just one but multiple women talking about franking credits or quantitative easing or whatever it might be. So if you are an economist, if you're an aspiring economist, if you have an interest in economics, please visit our website, think about joining the network. I can promise you plenty of interesting discussions and chance to be part of that real change. So my job this evening is to introduce Tory, our fantastic moderator. Tory is the Advertiser's state editor. She's a senior columnist as well as the author of the book on freedom. You can catch her on the ABC, on Sunrise, on The Project, and various other places for people who like to sit on panels and talk about politics. Lady after my own heart. I thought you had the best bio ever. She is a Churchill Fellow, a Walkley Judge, a chili fanatic, a dog lover. She enjoys writing about social justice, feminism, bad science, and bad guys, so she's the perfect moderator for this evening. Welcome, Tory.
I'm really embarrassed about that. I think I just shot off an email saying, here's some stuff I'm interested in, and didn't really think about the fact it would become public. So, you guys have actually already had the introduction to our fabulous speakers tonight, so I'm just going to add a little bit as they make their way up. So Professor Clare Wright, I called her doctor before, note to self, not her, but other people punched me, who for a history, that's true, for a history professor is probably the least fusty and musty history professor you've ever seen in your life. Senator Penny Wong, whose single raised eyebrow is worth 1,000 words. This is heaps fun not doing proper bios. And Annabel Crabb, who eviscerates politicians quite nicely with a whiff of nutmeg. So, Professor, we're just going to go. We're going to go to first names now. I'm sorry. I want to start with you and that fabulous story about the amendment that brought us women's suffrage.
Yeah. Okay. So December 1894. We're almost there now. It was the 17th of December, a hot Adelaide day. I was just saying to Elizabeth before, I think this is the first time I've ever been to Adelaide and it wasn't roasting hot. And so put yourself on one of those days down at Parliament House. It's just been opened, newly opened. And it looks like something historic is about to happen, which is that a suffrage bill that will grant women the right to vote is going to get up in the South Australian Parliament. Now remember that these bills to give women the right to vote have been going forward into colonial parliaments from the early 1880s. And what generally happened in all the colonial parliaments is that they go into the lower house, which was the elected house, the people's house, popular representation. They go through, fine, and then they get stymied in the upper house, which still had a property qualification. So this was really still the bastion of not just the status quo, but conservative forces and elitism and privilege. So in 1894, South Australia had a really unique situation. It was the first time in which there was a non-conservative majority in the upper house. A funny thing had happened with the South Australian elections that year, and indeed the situation would reverse very quickly as well. It was like this little window that opened. And so the women who had been organising the suffrage movement in South Australia, led by that indomitable woman Mary Lee, wasted no time in getting another bill forward, and it looked like it was going to get up. It looked like the numbers were going to be there in the upper house. So at the last minute, one of the Conservative members of the House added an amendment to the bill that he thought was surely going to sink the bill. And this was an amendment that would allow women also to stand for Parliament.
Outrageous.
Outrageous. Look, the Labor Party weren't asking for that. Not even the women were asking for that. That was just like a bridge too far. No one around the world had contemplated that there might be lady candidates, as they called them. And so that he puts the amendment forward with that kind of this is going to do it, and the vote is taken, and as the reporters said the next day, the ayes were sonorous and cheery, and because they held the day. And the women, the gallery was filled with women. They were sitting up behind the Speaker's chair, and they were climbing up the banisters, and the House erupted. And apparently one of the Conservative members said, "There goes the Hens Convention." And so nothing's much changed, has it? And so, you know, it really has to be one of the most incredible political belly flops in history.
It's the greatest story ever, isn't it?
I love it. It's just wonderful.
Is it a reverse wedgie?
It's a reverse wedgie.
I think it's a reverse wedgie. I think that's a technical political
and
term.
so suddenly South Australian women were the most fully enfranchised women in the world. And it's important to remember as well that that included Indigenous women, that there was nothing that distinguished Indigenous men and women now from the other voters in the state. So it's an extraordinary high watermark in Australian democratic history that was going to go on and have incredibly important repercussions when it came to federation.
Although it wouldn't be like it was more than 2 decades after that that the first woman actually was elected to an Australian legislature, and that also involved a bit of a banana skin moment too, right? Because Thomas Draper, who was the Attorney General in the state Parliament of Western Australia, great man obviously, thought it's about time we actually entitled Western Australian women to run for Parliament, and he was the member for, I think, West Perth. Anyway, so he ushered that through the Parliament. Brilliant. Well done, Thomas. And then there was an election, and Edith Cowan stood for his seat and won it. Sorry about that. I always feel a bit sorry for that dude, because obviously quite a good guy. See you later, Thomas. Thanks for all your help.
Thanks.
And on a slightly sombre note, we also then went ahead and disenfranchised Aboriginal women, which I think is something that's important to acknowledge, and we can maybe talk a bit more about later. You said, so what was the quote about the hen house, or there's the...
there goes the hens convention.
There goes the hens convention. There were so many funny phrases in your book, like the winter-faced women and the flat-chested... and
hilarious.
And the shrieking... What was the shrieking...
The shrieking sisterhood.
Shrieking sisterhood. I'm reading it and I'm thinking I'm still seeing very similar things in the, not just the dark corners of the internet, but in the Australian Senate sometimes. So... Senator.
What an segue.
I know. How much do you think
Look at that eyebrow. It's
I
going
think-
already.
Wow. I think it's coming for
It's
me.
really not. This is going well.
This is going well.
I said I'd be the most serious person on this panel by a mile. I'm just going to be I'm being very quiet and serious.
Just one eyebrow quirk. It's
No,
all
no,
it
I'm
takes.
just
Everyone
gonna
will.
I'm just going to stay here and be very quiet.
Okay, so the floor is yours.
What am I
You don't
what am I
get to be
talking
quiet.
about?
How far do you think? Shrieking sisterhood. Do you think that people still think there's a shrieking sisterhood, or have
This
we
is all being
moved
videotaped
beyond?
and videoed and clear.
Well, we can turn it off if we all want to go off the record.
Okay, so I can give an answer about percentages and where we've got to, and we know we're still, what is it?
Yeah,
60?
we know all that stuff.
But you're asking a cultural question, aren't you? I think that it takes a long time to change culture, and I think that is in part a critical mass proposition, and it is in part a normative proposition, and I've been in Parliament 17 years, it's a very long time. I know, that freaked you out, didn't it? It freaked me out.
Because Crabby's thinking about when she was reporting on
Yeah,
federal
she's-
Parliament
exactly,
17 years ago.
exactly. Yeah.
So I remember your arrival in
Yeah.
Canberra.
Yeah, so do I. It's so different. And I think it has got better, but at the risk of sounding poor us, because you always then get sort of smashed is too strong a word, but you do get, they're playing the victim again. I love that. People always say, so often say that.
Usually after bashing you about the
Correct.
about the head
About something.
playing
yeah.
victim.
So don't play the victim. I
Don't use the woman's card.
Oh yeah, that's because it's been effective. It's been easy, and the race,
Yeah.
and sexuality.
Oh, you got it. Yeah.
You're playing with the full deck,
yeah,
baby.
full deck.
Full deck.
So you were going to be the boring guy, but actually you're the intersectional guy, right?
Yeah.
I actually can I
You've
divert
taken
for a sec?
care
Yes,
of
you
all
can.
of the diversity.
So I did morning TV once. I think it was Channel 10 or something, and they always make you up a lot for morning TV. I don't know why that is. What you explain
Actually,
it to
Crabby
me.
has written a brilliant piece about that.
There's probably.
Have I?
Yeah.
About how men get off lightly
and
because
there's
they get the
women-
10-minute dab. and we
Anyway,
have to
so
sit there and be cold.
there I am, made up, and it's morning TV, so you're trying to be lighter, and I'm not so good at being light, as you know. It's not going to go so well.
Apparently
And
not so far.
No,
Would you
and then
agree?
this woman says to me, and I've forgotten. She says, "Well, basically, you're like, she's a gay, Asian, or something, female." I said, "You're like the Holy Trinity." I'm like, awkward moment on morning TV.
What did you say? Or did you
I
just
can't
look-
remember.
be
I
as
think I said
horrified?
blah, blah, blah. Oh, no, that. So, like, I'm going to get all the Christians getting really angry now. It's not even my fault.
Do you see how I asked her a difficult question and she went down this awesome anecdote that actually did distract
Anyway,
colleagues?
so no, I think that it is better. It is still a work in progress. I actually think still there are a lot of people, well, there are people in the parliament, men in the parliament, who still do find it, find it difficult to know how to deal with women with power. And so the way in which they respond is different. I can tell an anecdote, but I have to de-identify the person because I've never put it into the media. I can come back to that if you like. And the second
Come
thing
back to me later time for the paper.
I think that sometimes there's been a lot written, and Julia Gillard actually talks a lot about this, the way, the sort of double bind for women in public life, and the way, you know, you're supposed to, what is expected of you is you're nicer and you're more emotional and you're more emotive and more compassionate and empathic and all of that, and you're not allowed to be certain things. And I think there's still how women are constructed in the media and how our behaviour is interpreted, I do think has different frames to men. Like I often observe, I'm not trying not to be partisan, but I often observe at times Scott Morrison's behaviour, and I think, I wonder if you're a woman with it, like if Gillard had behaved like that, how she would have got away with it.
Like which bits?
The Pentecostal church bit?
This is an insight. Did you see that? She moved into insiders mode then, like which bits?
Do you know how good it is moderating a panel where Annabel Crabb's sitting next to you and can basically carry the whole thing, right?
Just tell her to butt out. Anyway, I think, well, this week in the Parliament, I think some of his, I think he, I don't want to be partisan at these events, so I'm trying not to be, but I actually think if that had been Julia Gillard as Prime Minister, that the way in which the behaviour would have been interpreted and written about would have been different.
But specifically about the Angus Taylor pushback, or what was the
His
specific?
mistakes, his grumpiness, his demeanour, I think we would have been, you know, she would have been very criticised.
Well, the interesting thing about that is that one of the
Like the anecdote.
main reasons, the rationales that women gave for why they should have the vote in the first place, and then once this idea of there being lady candidates was raised, and certainly those first women...
Lady candidates?
The lady candidates.
We should adopt that
Yeah,
for something.
Lady candidates!
I know, yeah.
Labour should have it on
candidates.
T-shirts at the
There
next
really
election.
was this idea that they would
That
make
they
the
would
place
purify
more
politics.
genteel,
So
right?
that was the whole idea.
That there'd be less sort of cussing and scratching.
That they would, the term that they used was that they would purify politics. This was the justification.
This
that
is like
women
Dan
were,
Pauls and God's Police,
It
isn't
is,
it?
but
Yeah.
this was the women's justification for it. And so the men were saying, no, you can't give women the vote. They can't be in politics because it will degrade them. They will become unsexed. They will become manly men. I mean, they didn't kind of have gender.
I think they still say that about
They
us.
didn't have gender diversity and non-binary in mind back in the late 19th century. But this concept that there would be manly men, that they would lose their feminine charms and graces, and that would
they'd neglect their
extend
children.
to they wouldn't want to have children anymore, and so this was going to be the end of the family, and the whole social order would come to
This is like incel culture, right?
well,
Almost.
it's actually a lot of the same arguments that came up in the marriage equality debates were very similar to the ones that were coming up with the anti-suffrage arguments. And so women, as a way to counter that, but also because they very much believed it wasn't just a political tactic, was that women being in politics would change the whole tone of politics. It would change the tenor of it. It would change the way that countries did politics. And not just on a country-by-country basis, but that women in power would actually change the world and change the world order because they would bring peace to the world. Because just as women were peacemakers in their own homes, that they were the ones that taught children to share, to take turns, that the women were the ones who were the ameliorators and the pillow smoothers, and they made everything good and nice and kind. So they would bring those skills, and they would be the political housekeepers. This is the other term that was used. And that they would housekeep
pillow
the
smoother.
world. And then there would
It
be
sounds like a euphemism, doesn't it? Oh, you old pillow smoother.
And then there would be no more war. Like, that was the extension of it. That there would be no more war. They hadn't really thought about Margaret Thatcher or, even Hillary Clinton for that matter is a hawk. So,
Actually, let's not let Penny derail this before she tells us the anecdote.
I wasn't derailing it. I was trying to develop the proposition.
Good, but let's do the anecdote first,
okay,
and then you
so
can...
I'm going to de-identify it because it isn't fair on him. So I had, there was a particular set of interactions that this person engaged in where he got into a lot of trouble, and towards me. And so, and he got to the media, etc. And he came to see me and apologised, said that's fine. But I said, I would like you to think about, or could you think about, you've got a wife and I think 2 daughters, a couple of daughters. I said, how you would feel in a workplace if someone behaved like that towards them in that way. And he said something fascinating. He said, I don't know how to deal with women like you. No, and actually I kind of rated it because at least he was honest. And I thought that's actually part of the problem, is that in his world, so he's obviously conservative, etc. In his world, you don't have a conflict with a woman like this. Like, you know, I was going him, he was going me. I can't remember what it was about, something that they were doing or we were doing, you know. But it was a political fight, a debate. But he knew how to do that with a bloke, but he couldn't do it with a woman without going personal. And I thought that's actually, as I said, I kind of rated it because at least he was honest about he actually didn't know how to handle it. And I think my kind of positive construction of that is I think that there are more men in Parliament now for whom this is less unusual. They are more used to, in their personal lives, engaging with the women that they're close to in their life in ways where there is less inequality of power, and I suspect that probably brings a capacity to engage in political conflict without going, I don't know, the various ways in which we're criticised.
Like in the last 20... Sorry, Tori, this will be the last...
I love it. This is so great.
On their waiters, but like... In the last... It's taken 25 years for the Labor Party to...
Get to 50%.
Yeah, after adopting that quota in that amazing party conference in Tasmania a quarter of a century ago. And do you think... Have men in the Labor Party got better at fighting with women without it being weird? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think... So
that's progress, that men have learned how to fight with women better. It is, though. It is.
It is part of what you teach your children, isn't it? How you manage conflict respectfully or appropriately. I mean, it's... Yes, I think that is a step. I mean, the affirmative action point... So the first rules I was involved in drafting, and I was on this... I remember being on this telephone group with a woman called Julia Gillard. 1990s, you know, and I'm like some little lawyer person going, but the actual logic behind it wasn't just to get a certain number of women into Parliament, it was actually to change the culture. And we had a view that this would actually force the party to change how it did. And, you know, it hasn't been... that we've still got a way to go, there's still behaviours that you want to change, but I actually think it fundamentally has, if I look over the 20 years, fundamentally changed the culture of our party, for the better.
It's an interesting... Oh, no, you go. I mean, jeez.
Would you two like me to sit between you? Would that
I heard Clare O'Neill on radio somewhere being asked about this, and it was when the Liberal Party was having their little, issues.
This is the bullying stuff.
Right, yeah. And she was asked about it on, I think she was on breakfast TV or something, and she said, oh, well, yeah, it's not really an issue in our party because if someone said something awful to me, I'd just go and tell Tanya and Penny and they would, kick that guy's ass.
Oh, you're like the bouncer guys.
It actually made me think, because it's not there is actually this sort of concentration of powerful women who just there's no real argument about whether it's right or wrong. It's just,
I'll stick Penny onto you. Now, I just want to ask her a question because otherwise this is just getting completely out of control. And also we get to plug your quarterly essay. Oh, yeah. What we started heading towards there is the male responsibility in this scenario. And obviously there are a whole lot of structural issues that we've got. We think we're heading towards equality, but it was the Australian Institute of Family Studies that said, no, men haven't changed their behaviour at all. It's the tiniest change that they've made to spend more time at home. So women are still carrying the load. And there was another study that showed that the bigger a breadwinner the woman was, the more domestic work she was taking on. I think the researchers... Yeah,
it's Australian research as well.
It's Australian research, and I think their conclusion was something like she's slightly guilty about being so successful, so she's overachieving in the domestic sphere to make sure everyone knows she's a good
The
woman.
theory is that, like, if you're violating one kind of tenet of feminine behaviour by being the primary breadwinner, then you compensate it by not violating the other one, which is that you do more of the domestic work. Anyway, it's very, you go, oh, that's ridiculous, until you can think of everybody you know who does that.
Yeah, exactly right.
Including on occasion myself.
Yeah. So talk us through the structural issues at the moment. How do we get blokes to pick up more of that?
Well, I mean,
Work.
I always think it's interesting that over these sort of transformative 50 years of change for Australian women, you know, we have changed the way that we live, work. The bit that we haven't really changed is the extent to which we take control of domestic responsibility in heterosexual families, with kids particularly, and a lot of the work that we do and the agonising that we do and the measuring that we do is actually in workplaces and in academic institutions and stuff like that. And so, and that's all been super valuable and helpful, but the thing that I think we've actually ignored a bit is, well, look, what happens with men at home, and why is it that while women have changed the way they, you know, they've really flooded into the workplace, there has been no real traffic the other way. I mean, it really hasn't changed all that much. And there's a terrifying, there's only one graph in this quarterly essay that I just published, and it is just a frightening graph put together by Jennifer Baxter, who is a great researcher at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. And she just does two graphs. This is what happens to a woman's life when she has a child in Australia, and it's sort of, you know, paid work goes, and then it kind of straggles back up over 10 years. And childcare obviously goes from 0 to 60 very quickly, and domestic work just goes up and then stays there. But on a man's, like an average man chart, it goes paid work, domestic work, childcare. Like it's kind of, you look at it and you're like, the woman chart looks like a person having an actual heart attack. And like, you think, okay, there it is.
It's funny when you tell it, but it is a deeply depressing graph.
And I think, well, you know, there's, I think we have a lot of awareness on what the expectations on women are, and how, you know, how complicated it is to juggle trying to be competent in two spheres at once, and constantly feeling as though you're failing in both of them. But I think I'm just fascinated to know more about what governs men's behaviour and the invisible forces that make it weird or shameful or risky for them to respond to work-life conflict in the same way that women do, which is actually quite sensibly, which is like, okay, I'll see if I can juggle this for a bit, and then I'll work part-time for a bit, and then I'll work from home, and I went, what? I'm not, you know, I'm not in a creche, no, I'm at work. And all of that stuff that everybody, you know, use the devices, just are not normal for men at all. And it just seems weird to me, because I think, well, evolution would sort of suggest that the changing the way you work to accommodate what else is going on in your life is a really sensible and normal human response to changing circumstances, but it just is not something that men have been doing.
Is there an incentive for them to do so?
Well, increasingly I think they have greater expectations on them as fathers, and they have greater expectations from their partners, but I think there's some real blocks in the workplace, and also from extended
Socially.
families as well, because and I think there are heaps of workplaces that have policies that where men can take parental leave, but I think there are often a lot of very, very clear other signals given for them for that not to be intended for them. You know, that's really a thing for women. And, you know, even our parental leave scheme, a lot of the private sector parental leave schemes are for primary carers, which is another way of saying the mum. And in fact, I was reading up about all these cases, quite high-profile ones in the States, involving men who have litigated against their employers because they've applied for parental leave and been rejected because they're not a woman. And
Wow.
right, and so there's been a few, like there was a big bank that had to like cough up a lot of money recently, and a few big broadcasters. Anyway, and I actually thought, oh, that's interesting. I'll go and find the Australian case law. There must be some sort of action on this. And there wasn't anything that I could find. And then so I rang up Kate, the Equal Opportunity Commissioner, and said, oh, Kate Jenkins, and said, is there any case law? And she said, oh, no, but there wouldn't be. And I said, oh, how come? She said, well, because the Sex Discrimination Act actually allows you to discriminate against men in issues of parental leave and anything to do with...
what does that look like? I mean, how do you even write that into...
Well, it was drafted in 1984, and when the primary issue was just trying to stamp out all this absolutely shitty stuff that was happening to women in the workplaces that they were moving into, right? Like, so it was all about harassment and discrimination around pregnancy and childbirth. And there's section 31, I think it is, says, well, nothing in this act prevents an employer from discriminating in favour of women.
You can discriminate in order to try and create greater equality, I think, is the conceptual point.
Right. So unintended
we're now
consequences.
in this kind of situation where, anyway, I just think it's, I mean, cultures evolve, right? And I think we're now in this this interesting position where there are visible and invisible barriers to men kind of participating in the home to the extent that women do. And I think it's interesting to look at those. And I think, sure, it's about attitudes, it's about all sorts of things. And I also am not a person who argues that men and women are exactly the same, or even that it doesn't make sense sometimes for one person in a family to do all of the paid work and the other person to do all of the domestic work. I just think it's bizarre that we have this kind of overlying assumption about which one of those two people will have the boobs. I just think it's...
There was a deeply depressing study out of Spain when they brought in parental leave, and the men who took parental leave after that didn't want any kids. They weren't having any more. They were like, oh, that sucked, I'm going back to work.
And they get naps as well.
I know, right? Now, Claire, I could see you wanting to jump in there.
No, I was going to say this is probably more your turf, Annabel, but there are some studies that have shown that if companies go, that there are structural solutions to this and economic imperatives, and that and economic incentives, that the companies that offer paid parental leave to fathers at full pay and on a lose it or use it scheme have gone from 2% take up to 60% take up. And so, you were saying that there are still cultural impediments to the way that Parliament runs, and obviously ones that, like, Julie with the misogyny speech called out and still need to be called out. So there's, I think we're still dealing with this difference between the cultural and the structural, and that's the really interesting thing about women who are campaigning for the vote. And I get asked a lot, is there anything that you can see in the Me Too movement now, and the so-called third wave or possibly fourth wave of feminism that we're going through, that are there lessons that can be learned from the suffrage movement? And I think one of the things that was so galvanising about suffrage was that there was this one single structural solution that they were working towards, which was the franchise. And that meant that you could get women from across class and from internationally, across borders, and from across parties, to be all able to be campaigning for this one collective outcome. And I think that is so much more difficult to do now. Things become so fractal. I was at a feminist conference a couple of weeks ago in Melbourne that the Wheeler Centre put on, called Broadside. And there was a panel on feminism and capitalism. And I really encourage you to have a look at it on the Wheeler Centre's website, because it's not actually often that you hear those two words put together, but they really should be more often. And it was actually in all, unlike this panel, that it was all women of colour. They were actually all black women, 3 from America, Fatima Bhutto from Pakistan, and they actually said, even though there's still an equal pay gap, the issue of equal pay came up, something that we've been fighting for since the suffrage movement. They were fighting for that too. And they said, we shouldn't be worrying about the equal pay anymore. It's a C-suite issue. It's about white women in power wanting to raise their executive salaries to the same level as men's. This is a women on boards issue. This is not addressing anything at the ground floor where really women's economic empowerment matters.
Well, the weird thing about the gender pay gap
agree.
is, if I can rudely interrupt for 2 seconds,
You can.
I'd always assumed it was kind of like a general kind of like, well, hand over your 17% at the end of the, like that it was even. But it is not even.
No,
like
no,
it is,
it's not
it
even
is.
at all.
In fact, it's almost non-existent among low-paid workers who are on, awards or basic rates. It's where it gets huge is right at industries that have finance, bonuses
industries
for
that are still male-dominated industries, like finance, like the resources industry. There's a shocking gender pay gap in mining, and trades and electrical trades and real estate and then that it is lower in female-dominated trades like teaching and nursing and child
Caring.
the caring professions. There's a smaller gap, but then it's such a smaller base to start with because the pay is so low.
totally coincidentally.
So my point is that I don't think that we should be ruling out trying to close that gap. I think those are still huge structural issues, but they are cultural ones as well because they are about what industries men go into, what industries women go into, and just in the same way that it's in the home, we're still working out who does what work in that public space, in private space. We're still working these out in a public sense as well. So I think actual goals, outcomes, and strategies towards structural change are still really important, and it's not time to throw them out the window.
I did just want to add one other horrifying piece of research, which is that when women move into a previously male-dominated industry, the wage goes down. Ugh. I did really interrupt you. But can we, before we go to questions, and you can say whatever you like, but also focus on that intersectionality and the way that privilege plays such a strong part here. I mean, even us being up here is, indicative of privilege, and I'm not, much of a self-flagellator, but I do get embarrassed about it every now and then. Do you get embarrassed about your privilege, Pennywell? Oh, that was so much fun!
She was kind of handed that Senate seat.
Didn't Don Farrell put his coat over a puddle for you?
It is
She's just been resting on her laurels ever since too.
It is amazing, though, isn't it? That sorry, I don't really want to talk about me, but if you think about when I went into Parliament, and at the time, Zabin Chen, who was Taiwanese senator from Victoria, of Taiwanese heritage, was in the Parliament too. He served one term and then left. How few people of Asian heritage, but more broadly, how the Parliament is still quite homogenous in terms of ethnicity. It is in terms of gender too. Like it's still
Also, education level.
and educational levels.
Professional background.
One of the proudest things for me actually has been having. We have our First Nations caucus in the Parliament, in the Labor caucus, and having Linda Burney and Pat Dodson and Malandiri McCarthy, and that's a start. Has been a real privilege actually, and watching how the caucus changes, when there are issues before the Labor caucus which touch on First Nations communities, and they are always, even though it may not be their shadow ministerial portfolio, there is a report from the First Nations caucus and they speak to it, and how that's changed, how we think it's actually quite beautiful. Anyway, I digress. I just wanted to go back to public and private, and Claire's point. Firstly, in the private sphere, one of the things I discovered when we had children, and it was a sort of, it was a sort of, in some ways, a sad revelation to me, was how many families still have incredibly stereotyped patterns of caring for kids. And I remember one time I took my first daughter to story time, or whatever it is, where you sing, the little green frog does this. But at the
You
local,
can sing if you like.
No,
I think everyone would
and
enjoy it.
and Sophie, because she wasn't a great sleeper, and I said to Sophie, what do you want to do? Do you want to stay home and have a sleep, or do you want? And she said, I'm going to go and have have a coffee. And I'm like, that's right, you got to have a coffee. And so we went and did this. And I was actually going to do Q&A that night. It was the night that Hockey did his thing.
I feel like I should just
It was
apologise.
the night Joy Hockey did his thing about marriage. So that was partly why I was so emotional, because I had this lovely time and I hadn't, I was a cabinet minister, so I didn't get a lot of this time, but I said, I'm going home and I'm going to take my daughter to the council thing. Now, while I was there, so the people in the mothers group are there, and one of them said, oh, she's really happy with you. And I was actually really confused. Yeah, and I thought, is this because there's been a couple? And then I think she said, oh, my husband hasn't spent more than 15 minutes alone with our child. And I thought, is that like, I actually was really sad by that. I wasn't trying to judge him. I thought, well, what that says about what the relationships are, and that was a real insight to me. Like, I hadn't realised that's how it was. I mean, she was, I don't know, how old are you when you're singing? So she's not like a tiny tot. I think it is changing to some extent. Like, I had young men who worked for me who were talking about when they wanted to have kids, what they wanted to do in terms of taking time off, and I'd never heard that conversation amongst my peers. My final point is, and this is, we actually thought, maybe Danielle or one of the economists should actually be on this panel rather than us.
We were all very scared when we heard Danielle was here.
I said,
Pick up the game.
yeah, she's going to think we're all really dumb. As someone who is engaged, this isn't an area where which has been my sort of public policy focus, but it has been an area that I have been interested in. I think the public policy offerings around what we do are not great. And and maybe somebody brilliant out here can tell me, but I feel like we recycle some of the same propositions around what we do, and I think we would really benefit from ideas around what is it you do to try and lessen the penalty for part-time work and flexibility, and for career interruption, which women disproportionately play. What can we do, as Annabel said, and which her essay goes to try and reduce the public and the structural disincentives for men to take a different role. That doesn't deal with the private allocation of labour within families, and that's a different cultural discussion.
It is, and pick up Crabby's essay, because she talks about particularly Prime Minister and our Treasurer, who is sort of like, oh yeah, I definitely try and FaceTime the kids every now and then, pop in and say hi. We're now going to throw you guys to the wolves. So,
these are the wolves?
these are the wolves. Look at that pack, come on.
I just want to say, men, one thing, I was campaigning in the last federal election with a particular female candidate, and this person asked her how she was going to cope because she had young children, a voter, and I thought, wow, I have never had a man be asked that I've campaigned with.
Never.
Ever.
No, it's the Jacinda Ardern scenario.
Yeah. It was also, just before you throw, one of the reasons
This is
that
the problem when you have a punchy panel.
men that
Filibustering.
This
the
is not
arguments that were
filibustering.
given against women voting was who was going to look after the baby when women actually went to cast their ballot. And there were all sorts of cartoons in newspapers with the woman handing the baby over to the man as she walks out to vote, and he's standing there like going, ooh.
I have testicles, I can't possibly look after a child.
Talking to Ros Kelly the other day, and she was the first woman to ever have a baby while serving in the Parliament.
Yeah.
And I mean, she was the member for Canberra, so it was in her hometown, and nobody tried it again for another 20 years after she did it. But she was working up until the night she went and had the baby, and then she was back a week later because nobody knew. She didn't know. She didn't want to be the person who dropped the ball and confirmed everybody's, fears that she wouldn't continue to be a great representative. So she took a week off and came back and ran herself absolutely into the ground, and then got pregnant again, like seriously a year and a half later. So she had 2 tiny kids and did not take one backward step. She was so frightened about confirming the fears. Yeah. Anyway.
And it's still
the kids are
newsworthy
fine,
that Amanda Rishworth actually, has her husband Tim chasing around with the bub, being the primary carer, to the point where when people voted in Kingston, a lot of people added a box and said, Tim. Because isn't it just above and beyond when men do anything? Anyway. Hands up.
Amazing.
Oh, sorry.
I wanted to talk about mental load. I feel like in my life I've got a very equal partner, husband, who does a lot of child caring without me. However, I feel I can't ever drop that mental load. When he's got the kids, I'm constantly ringing and checking he's remembered the sunscreen and, you know, have you picked them up on time and that sort of thing. And I feel like that's part of the reason women just do things themselves, because it's just as much mental load to let the man do it. Do you think we need to start talking about this as a problem that women actually need to force the man to take responsibility, and then, you know, like the Bluey episode where she brings all the stuff for the swimming, just let them stuff it up and then they'll get used to it and you can just let them do it?
What you're doing is called maternal gatekeeping, and it's a really hard thing to not do. And look, the truth is this is where parental leave is actually really important. I mean, proper parental leave, not take a week off and build a flat pack shed, which is what happens in my house. But because if two people get together and have a baby, like nobody knows how to do that, right? Like people, like there's this whole like women just know.
No.
They just know. No, they do not just know. They really just do not know. So you have a period where everybody is at expertise level 0. Like maybe you've read some pamphlets or some books or dozed off in the middle of Robin What's-Her-Face or whatever. But what happens is usually, because of the way historically we've structured it in Australia, like the mum will take 6 months to a year off, during which time, particularly if she's a more mature mother who's already had a career, she gets really good at it because she's like, I'm competent. I'm going to smash this. And so before you know it, there's an expertise there that is completely unequal. And so the real test, there's that joke about where like guys say, I'm going to babysit my kids tonight. He's like, not babysitting when it's your kid. The only way you can really get great at it is to be the person who is solely responsible, including for any accidentally sunburned children that happen or whatever. And that is high wire, but like it's the only way to get there. So, and the earlier you start, the closer together your standards of incompetence are, and the less bad it is. Because like the worst place you can get to, particularly after one child, is this whole like, I'll give it here, it's quicker if I do it. Because then you have another baby, guess who's definitely not going back to work? And so that is how women end up with really shit superannuation, basically.
I have an anecdote. So I've been married for 25 years. I turned 50 this year. I've been married for 25 years and I've been with my husband. We were together for 6 years before that. So we got together when we were 19. And we have 3 children, and who are now young. 2 of them are young adults. They're 20 and 22, and we have a 14-year-old as well. I agree with your point about, and this is for young women or men in the room who are not up to that yet, about negotiating and talking about these things early on. Because there's so many things that we just never talked about. And so I'm finding myself like 30 years down the track into a relationship now where everything is just so division of labour. We haven't talked about it since forever. We never did. About 2 years ago, I realised that I was completely sick of buying all the presents for Christmas and all the birthday presents and all the Mother's Day presents and all the Father's Day presents for his family. This is not something that we'd ever sat down and said, now who's going to buy all the presents every year? And this is why they say Christmas is a feminist issue. And I just stopped. I decided I couldn't even be bothered holding the mental load of having the conversation about the fact I didn't want to do it anymore. So I just stopped, and then I thought, sorry darling, I'm there on the camera, I'm spilling the beans to everybody. I thought he can ask me why I haven't bought his mother a birthday present. Is he going to do that? No, of course he's not going to do that. And he's never done it. So for the last 2 years, nobody in his family has had a present. And we've saved a lot of money.
Has it been like made patent though? Have you had a conversation about it, or do you just like go from wow?
I never had a conversation. I never said anything.
But he
I
doesn't. He say,
stopped.
don't he say, oh, have you decided that we're changing this or something because there's no
No,
precedent?
because then
Wow.
he would have to draw attention to the fact that for 28 years I've been buying.
This is really interesting way to negotiate this. Well, okay.
Not where I thought we'd end up.
This is not where I thought we'd end up either. We actually really have to wrap up. But
It's okay.
can we have, yes, can we please just have one finishing note from each of you so we don't end with me and the old man down the chimney?
Okay.
Look, I just we said we'd circle back to this before, but we didn't.
only had
And
one
like we
question.
had this 2-second point. We said we'd come back to the temporary enfranchisement and then disenfranchisement of Indigenous women and in fact Indigenous men, because the federal legislation of 1902 actually stripped Indigenous people, some Indigenous people,
Most.
of the vote. There were some property provisions that still enfranchised some Indigenous people, but precious few. And look, it makes this a really complicated anniversary to celebrate, I think. The 1902 anniversary, like the South Australian one is an easier one, but that was a really kind of mixed up sort of triumph, really, because it was a very, very, very slow walk back from that. Anyway, the general point that I want to make is one of the things that I find super exciting about the last few years is the Indigenous women's voices that are now more and more and more audible, thanks to being in Parliament or thanks to being usually on the ABC. And I would encourage you all for a beautifully structured, profound walk through the history with a hopeful heart and a great brain. I would recommend Rachel Perkins' Boyer lectures that are up on the ABC iView right now. They're so worth listening to. Thank you. I'll shut up now.
Final thoughts and observations.
You've got a mic.
Oh, I've got a mic. I think, I was just checking my notes, I think it's still only 76% of eligible Indigenous Australians are enrolled to vote. So we still have a lack of equality of franchise in actuality. I didn't have any last final brilliant thoughts.
No, that is actually an excellent observation.
So-
I didn't know that, and I'm glad I do, and I don't know what the hell to do about it.
And
Claire.
of course, Indigenous Australians weren't even counted in the census until 1967. They were literally not counted, which is the basis of
When was the
democracy,
franchise
isn't it?
actually provided? 62?
63.
63.
Sorry, 62. Yeah, 62.
So
is the
60
vote.
years between
Yes,
taking it
between
away
taking away
and returning it.
And returning. My final thoughts. I'm really glad you raised that point, Annabel, about this being a complicated anniversary. Agreed. South Australia's is much more obvious to celebrate, and you should celebrate, and we all should celebrate. And we don't celebrate these victories enough, women's achievements, and we certainly don't celebrate them as part of our democratic heritage. And this is what I've been trying to do in my research. I often say I don't write women's history, I write Australian political history with the women put back into it, because they are part of this story. They're part of this story. And one of the things that was so interesting for me about researching this last book, You Daughters of Freedom, was seeing that in 1902, in the context of the times, which were racialised, this is racialised thinking, that was the fundamental building blocks of the new Australia that was going forward. First act that was passed by the new Parliament was the Immigration Restriction Act, otherwise known as the White Australia Policy, and the second act was the Franchise Act that disenfranchised Indigenous people and made race, not gender, the disqualification for citizenship in this country. But within that context, what was so extraordinary was realising that Australia was the democratic exemplar for the world. We led the world. We were recognised as having as being the most democratic nation on earth at a time where the rest of the world was looking for these answers to this solution, which at the time was called the woman problem. And the problem was that women were demanding their rights all over the world. So how are you going to find a solution to this? Well, Australia found it first. And so the rest of the world's eyes were trained on Australia. And Australia was really incredibly proud of the role that it played in the world as a leader. And I think that now that we are such laggers in policy, now that we are so behind the eight ball, that we follow other countries into wars, into policy, that it's really important to remember that there was a time in our history when we were the progressive leaders of the world, that we knew it, that the rest of the world knew it, that we were much braver and much more courageous and much more independent thinking than we are now. And that gives me just a little glimmer of hope that we could be that again.
Can I just say, read her book, because this lady specialises in writing really big, thick history books that read like bloody thrillers. They are just so great. And the last thing I want to say is, all of you women in economics, can you please pick up the phone when journalists call you and think about writing op-eds and stuff like that? Like, seriously, there is such a huge underrepresentation of women as experts, as interviewees, and I know that that's partly our fault because we have a rota of people that go to, but like, also don't ever think, oh, I haven't done that before, write an op-ed or be quoted or whatever. Don't do the whole thing where you go, oh, actually I'm not quite exactly qualified, but this guy over here is amazing. Like, do it because we want you to, and you're excellent. All right, thank you.
That was pretty amazing. I'm so sorry that it sort of went so swiftly. I think we could probably have gone all night, but, you know, let's have a podcast. Oh, look at that.
Hi everyone, my name is Elizabeth Alvaro and I'm the chair of the Women in Economics Network in South Australia. Thank you so much, Tory, Senator Wong, Professor Wright and Annabel. I'm sure we can agree we were just treated to an incredibly insightful discussion spanning history, present day and the future. What an awesome group of women. Please join me in thanking our panel. I think this provides a good place for us to stop and reflect. Clare, I started reading your book and I was struck not only by how South Australia was well ahead of its time, but also the role of South Australian women in the suffrage movement, and I will admit I had absolutely no idea. I think the link between political and economic empowerment is quite fascinating, and I do hope we can continue to shape history through an increasingly representative parliament in the future with greater participation in decision making. Now we have some more drinks at the back, so please don't rush out and leave. But firstly, please join me in once again thanking our panel, not only for their role tonight, but also over the course of their careers. Thank you.